I want to start us and welcome you all to the second installment of our Ed Working Papers webinar series from the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. I'm Nate Schwartz. I'm the Director of Applied Research at Annenberg, and I'll make a couple quick housekeeping announcements, and then I will pass you on for the main attraction. So first, to situate you all in the ecosystem here, the Annenberg Ed Exchange is composed of an increasingly broad network of researchers, policymakers, and practitioners, all aiming to make education research more relevant, more useful, and more accessible. If you haven't already, please sign up for our newsletters. We've got a measurement initiative at Instruments, research synthesis initiative at Research for Action, and we've got our Working Papers initiative, which brought you here today, Ed Working Papers. Since this is new, I want to direct your attention quickly to the Policy and Practice series on our Ed Working Papers site. So we've just started doing this and we're feeling kind of excited about it. These are short summaries of our most timely and policy relevant working papers. And what we try to do in these briefs is highlight the main findings and identify implications to inform decision-making in real-world contexts. So when you're getting that usual digest of Ed Working Papers, you'll also see these little two-pagers. We've got about 25 of them on our site so far, and we're continuing to produce several a month. Both of the papers that you'll hear about today have these summaries available, and we have at least been told that they're helpful for continuing the conversation, especially when you're having the policy version of this conversation. The second housekeeping announcement is that I know we have a lot of working paper authors on this webinar today. And so I just wanted to explain quickly our review board. I'm excited to announce that we've selected our next board of paper reviewers for 2026. So this board, these are the heroic people behind the scenes who read all of the hundreds of papers we receive each year and make sure that these papers hold up as ready for posting. Some of you will receive the sort of long questions we sometimes send your way when we see things in the paper that we don't quite understand, and we appreciate all your patience with this. So first, I'm thanking our outgoing reviewers, Chris Weiland, John Easton, and Dominique Baker, who have done incredible things for the last 2 years. And here's our new group. This includes, as you can see, Daphne Basak, Stella Flores, Jen Jennings, and Constance Lindsay. And we are so grateful that they're joining in January. So with that as the backdrop, I'm excited to pass the mic to our review board chair, Susanna Loeb, who's going to facilitate today's discussion. We're really proud at the Ed Exchange and at Annenberg to lead work that advances the field through rigorous inquiry and collaboration. And we're really honored to host today's conversation as part of that ongoing commitment. Before you leave, please click our survey. Let us know how this experience has been for you and how we can continue. This is, as I said, this is number 2 of hopefully many of these webinars. So how we can continue to make these better for you. Over to you, Susanna.
Thanks, Nate. I'm Susanna Loeb, as Nate said. I'm a professor at Stanford and co-chair the review board with Nate. So on to the main show. Today's session brings together 2 really timely and complementary analyses of post-pandemic American education. One asking why achievement has been slipping for more than a decade, and the other probing how the structure of schooling itself has shifted in response to the pandemic. So first, Jim Wyckoff from the University of Virginia will present his paper, Puzzling Over Declining Academic Achievement, which shows that the pandemic accelerated a decline in K-12 achievement in the US, but that this decline actually began well before 2020. Then Josh Goodman and Abigail Francis from Boston University will discuss their paper, School Enrollment Shifts 5 years after the pandemic, which focuses on the exodus of families from US public schools, both for private schooling and for homeschooling. Papers raise potential approaches for addressing reduced student achievement and reduced trust in public education. So Jim, will you start us off?
Great, thanks, Susanna. So I want us to spend a few minutes thinking about a graph that I think maybe some version of this graph is probably pretty familiar to you. It's the history of NAEP for low-performing students. You've seen versions of this, or certainly the data that lies behind it, because it's constantly in the newspapers as new NAEP results get released. I'd like to focus on 4 aspects of this graph, or the data actually that lies behind it. The first is the very large declines that have occurred. The declines began about 2013, but I think the slowing of improvement began more about 2009. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I also want to think a little bit about the substantial variation that lies behind this graph across the 50 states. Of course, there's the inevitable question of what led to this decline. And I want to sort of talk a little bit about the lots of speculation that has occurred in terms of what led to the decline, and then think a little bit about what the implications for research and policy might be. So that decline follows on the heels of over 20 years of substantial improvement. And this was a very large improvement in the achievement of the low-performing students. We also saw very large improvements for students in the middle of the distribution and certainly at the top of the distribution. So this is almost 60% of a standard deviation of improvement, which we could translate is roughly 2 years of learning that the low-performing students in 2013 had that the students back in 1990 didn't have. So by any measure of the way we think about impact, this is a huge increase in improvement. And then, as I said, beginning about 2009, that improvement began to slow and eventually started a continuous decline since 2013. And that decline has been also substantial. So for the first 6 years between 2013 and 2019, this is approaching 20% of a standard deviation, almost half a year's worth of learning that the lowest performing students lost over that period. And as Susanna suggested, that decrease in achievement accelerated during the pandemic. So now there's almost half a standard deviation of loss that has occurred between 2013 and 2024. Again, this is huge by any standards of education policy, about 1 3/4 years worth of learning. And we can think about this relative to the Black-White achievement gap or other very large measures of achievement. And this was losses, and while the losses were certainly largest among the lowest performing students, students at the median in that pre-pandemic period also lost ground in 8th grade math and 8th grade reading. Again, not nearly as large, but still 8 and 9% of standard deviation are metrics that get the attention of most education policy folks. So again, I think there's been a lot of discussion, and rightly so, about the impact on the lowest part of the performance distribution. But this is something that actually has impacted the whole distribution. And even though the high-performing students, those at the 90th percentile, still showed either flat or relatively small positive gains, those are much smaller gains than they had experienced in the earlier periods. And all of that then ends up getting exacerbated by the pandemic. So I think this is a more general phenomena than we had, I think, at least than I had thought up to that point. And I want to think a little bit about what the implications of those pre-pandemic losses might mean for what we experienced during the pandemic. So there's been a lot of focus, and I think rightly so, on the learning losses that occurred during the pandemic. Kids were affected in all sorts of ways, and mostly in negative ways, not just around their achievement, but around other aspects of their lives. And so nothing I'm about to say should diminish or trivialize the impacts of the pandemic. However, if we just took a straight linear projection of what had occurred between 2013 and 2019, we would have accounted for about 47% of the learning losses that occurred during the pandemic. And so I guess the point that I wanted to try to make here that was really sort of surprising to me is that the pandemic was devastating to kids, but the roots for much of the learning loss that occurred, nearly half of it for these lowest performing kids, had its roots beginning about 2013 and continuing over that 6-year period prior to the pandemic. And I think that has some important implications for at least how I've thought a little bit about some of the policy implications that we'll get to. So if you take all that together, roughly 2/3 of the learning loss that occurred over this whole period, this 11-year period between 2013 and 2024, almost 2/3 of that could be thought of as being attributable to factors that were in play before the pandemic. There's all sorts of qualifications that come with taking this linear projection. So I don't want to overemphasize the 47% as opposed to a third or even more. But I think the point here is that there are other things going on besides the pandemic that we ought to be concerned about. The thing that perhaps surprised me the most was the range of effects across states. And so here are some graphs for low-performing students on the 8th grade math and the 8th grade reading. And these are just the losses that occurred prior to the pandemic. If I showed you the pandemic learning losses in some of these states, you might go home very, very sad. This is there are some states, Mississippi among them, that either showed very small losses depending on the test or even gains in that pre-pandemic period, whereas other states showed losses that are between 35 and 50% of a standard deviation before we even get to the pandemic. And so those are just huge losses. And I think when we'll get to a discussion in just a second about what the potential causes of all of this might be. But I think as you think about causes, it's tempting to look at those national graphs and think about, well, what are the things that fit with what happened between 2013 and 2024 that might align with these declines? And I think that's right. We ought to be doing that. But we also then ought to think about, well, why would we have such a different experience in Mississippi and Tennessee and some other states than we've had in, Alaska, Rhode Island, Delaware, some of the states that are on the far left side of this graph. And so for me, as the title of the article says, this has been a puzzle trying to sort of think this through. And I want to emphasize that this is not just a quirk of the NAEP. So when you compare the results of the NAEP over the 2011 to 2019 period, those are the bars for 4th grade and 8th grade reading on the far right. You get very similar results we see from the TIMSS. And so 2 different tests, constructed and applied in different ways, are showing that the US has lost ground in a fairly consistent way across those tests. I've also done this with the CETA test scores at the in these same ways at the state level, where I've correlated the CETA test results, which again are collected in a quite different way from NAEP, to the NAEP results, and those correlations are very high, between 82 and 94%. So across 3 different tests, collecting data in different ways for different purposes, we see very similar patterns. And so I think this is not something about the peculiarities of any given test. The other point I'd make is that this is quite different than what's happened in many other countries. And so the bars on the left part of this diagram show you what's happened to not all, but a group of OECD countries for which there is data between 2011 and 2019. And you see modest improvements in those countries depending upon the grade level. And so our experience, something's going on here, and it's not to say that some of those OECD countries don't have, there are some of those countries that do have graphs that look very similar to ours. Again, at first blush, I was a little puzzled as to figure out how to make sense of that, though. So many people have speculated about what might have caused these declines. And some people have speculated that early on this might have related to the Great Recession, where many states actually cut back school spending by a lot. On average, it fell between 2009 and 2013 by about $1,000 a pupil, but some states were over $2,000 a pupil. And it's hard to believe that spending reductions of that magnitude didn't have some impact at least early on in this period. Other people have speculated that, NCLB, the consequential accountability that accompanied NCLB, began to fade out about 2013. ESSA was introduced in 2015. And so again, in a timing sequence, this aligns pretty well with the declines we're seeing. I think it certainly doesn't account for the magnitude or the variability across states. State policy innovation varies a lot across states. The Mississippi example is a good one. Mississippi was one of the lowest performing states prior to 2010, and it made a number of changes. It signed on to Common Core, which was a much more rigorous version of standards than it had before that. It introduced the science of reading in a very systematic way in 2013, and so willing to believe that Mississippi staved off some of these declines as a result of innovation that they did. Many people, and this is a popular speculation, that smartphones and social media have caused students to be less engaged. And I think there's increasing evidence for that. Sorry, that was me. And the changing composition of students might be another aspect of this, where in some states have experienced dramatic increases in the proportion of kids who are English language learners or special ed. And we know that might have affected test outcomes as well. And finally, some people have argued that the Common Core might have accounted for some of what's going on here, in the sense that the Common Core might have established learning standards that some schools found it very difficult, even demotivating, to try to reach, and therefore kids got disengaged, teachers got disengaged. I think as I look through all these and the evidence that we have around each of them, none of these, certainly by themselves, fits the magnitude or the pattern of the declines that we've seen. I came away from all this believing this must be some combination of these and or other things. And I think there's lots of room for future research, for people, enterprising PhD students and others, to try to dig into this in a little more detail and try to figure out what's been going on. And so in summary, I think the pandemic induced some really meaningful learning losses. But I think a singular focus on that has distracted us, both researchers and policymakers, from some of the important longstanding achievement declines. And so for me, this is a both and kind of story. We need to worry about both things. I think, as I said a minute ago, there's a lot more we can be doing as researchers to better understand the causes of the decline and therefore focus some of the policy effort. Even so, I think that state and local policymakers can partner with researchers to implement a number of proven interventions to increase student achievement, even if we don't have the definitive autopsy on what caused these declines. So I guess I would just say, for me, an important takeaway on this is that, especially in the era that we're living in now, that it would be important for state and local folks to embrace this in a way that thinks about the systematic or the system-wide kinds of policy interventions that we might be addressing, as opposed to, again, the important work that's been done on learning loss recovery that might just be targeting a few cohorts of kids in summer school or for tutoring. Those are great interventions. Again, I'm not trying to disparage that at all, but I think we have to think more systematically about the other things that have been going on in the system for a longer period of time. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. I had read your paper, and the numbers that you showed here that I hadn't kind of focused on before that were really striking was that actually the reduction for the lowest achieving group in the earlier period was as big as it was during the pandemic. That seemed amazing to me, that it was that you had those things so similarly, while the reductions for the other groups weren't very much. So that difference in that first part seemed particularly striking. I'm sure we'll get to some of that as we go forward, but now let's turn it over to Josh Goodman to talk about his work with Abigail on school enrollment shifts since the pandemic. Josh.
Thanks so much, Susanna. Thanks to everyone for being here. I'm going to talk about a project that I've done this past year with Abigail Francis, who is a second-year PhD at our BU Wheelock Education Policy PhD program. This is school enrollment patterns 5 years after the pandemic. And the starting point for this is, I don't have to say this, that the pandemic obviously drastically disrupted the functioning of public schools. And in the first couple of falls following the pandemic, in each fall, I wrote a research paper about how the pandemic was changing school enrollment patterns. And so just to give you a couple of stats to set the table, in the fall of 2020, public school enrollment in the United States dropped by 3%, which was the biggest annual year-to-year drop since World War II, pulled a bunch of teenagers out of high school for military service. Where did that drop sort of go, or where did those students go? Homeschooling rates jumped very much, particularly for low-income families, probably because they were afraid of the virus itself and wanted to isolate their children and protect their health. Private schooling rates jumped, largely among high-income families who seem to be frustrated by public school closures. The following year, in fall of 2021, some of those students returned to public schools, but not all. Only about a fifth of the students who left for private schools in the fall of 2020 had returned by the next year. About half of those who had left for homeschooling had returned. And in one of our research papers with Andrew Bakker-Hicks, Kevin Stang, and Tarina Musadik, we had this quote that we said, pandemic-driven public school enrollment declines may persist, and more so among high-income families, given the patterns we were seeing in the fall of 2021. And so what Abby and I wanted to do with this paper was to say, look, people have sort of stopped writing about this question. It's now 5 years after the onset of the pandemic. Has everything snapped back to normal, or have there been some semi-permanent changes in school enrollment patterns? And we're going to do this first in the context of Massachusetts, using Massachusetts Education to Career Research and Data Hub, which we use because Massachusetts posts extremely timely information on school enrollment patterns, both in public and private and home schools. And so that's why we're going to work in Massachusetts. And I'm going to show you a series of graphs, all of which have the same format, which is we've normalized everything to the fall of 2019, which is the last pre-pandemic year. And so that's the dot in the middle of your screen. And everything else is a measure of enrollment relative to that last pre-pandemic year, where the black dots are actual enrollment levels. And then the line of best fit there is our prediction about what post-pandemic enrollment levels should have looked like given pre-pandemic trends. So it just fit a line to the pre-pandemic data, carry it forward. And all the way on the right, then you see, as of last school year, the black dot is actual school enrollment, and the open circle is what we would have predicted enrollment would have been. And so the way to think about this with respect to local public schools in Massachusetts is that as of the fall of 2024, public school enrollments were down over 4% relative to the fall of 2019, or about 2% below the trend we would have predicted because Massachusetts was losing some school-age population. But what that means is that relative to pre-pandemic trends, Massachusetts local public schools have lost about 17,000 students. So then the question is, where did they go? And so one answer is many of them went to private schools. So the private school population in Massachusetts was shrinking pre-pandemic, and we predict would have continued to shrink. But the pandemic basically stabilized enrollment in private schools, which to this day is about the same as it was 5 years ago, which means that private schools have roughly 11,000 more students in them than the pre-pandemic declining trends would have predicted. So a good chunk of those missing public school students went to Massachusetts private schools. And so just to be clear, that means that private school enrollment is up about 16% relative to what we would have predicted because of the pandemic. But private schools weren't the only option. Homeschooling was also an option for Massachusetts students. And you can see that in the fall of 2020, immediately following the onset of the pandemic, homeschooling Massachusetts jumped by over 100%, more than doubled. That rate has come back down, but not anywhere close to what it was pre-pandemic, so that homeschooling rates are still about 50% above the trend that we would have predicted pre-pandemic, which means there are about 4,000 students in the state of Massachusetts now being homeschooled who would not have been absent the pandemic. One of the most striking patterns we see in the data when we ask, well, which public school districts are losing students to some of these other options, there's extremely strong heterogeneity by district income. So on the left, what you see is the graph of enrollment patterns for the highest income 20% of Massachusetts school districts. Those districts have lost about 6% of their students with no signs of recovery, which means that they've lost about 10,000 students in total. On the right are the other 80% of Massachusetts school districts, the middle and low income districts. Those districts are at this point only about 1% below the trend we would have predicted, which means they've lost a little under 7,000 students. In other words, the majority of the public school losses in the entire state of Massachusetts come from the wealthiest 20% of school districts. So this is at this point largely a high income district phenomenon. Similarly, if we break this down by student race and ethnicity, what you see in the top two panels is that the enrollment losses in local public schools are heavily concentrated among white and Asian students. So the upper left panel shows you that white student enrollment in Massachusetts public schools has basically been about 3% below pre-pandemic trend ever since fall of 2020 and has shown no signs of recovery since then. Asian student enrollment is now down about 8% relative to trend. So we're about 5,000 Asian students are no longer in Massachusetts local public schools. In contrast, in the lower left panel, you see that Hispanic student enrollment, though it dipped immediately following the pandemic, is basically back to trend. Black student enrollment, which also dipped pretty substantially in the early years of the pandemic, is now well above trend, although that is a little bit confounded by a large influx of Haitian immigrants who aren't distinguishable in this particular data set. But the point is that there's clear declines in white and Asian student enrollment, and Hispanic and Black enrollment appears to have basically recovered or potentially more than fully recovered. You can also see very clear heterogeneity by the age of the students at this point. Pre-K and kindergarten rates, which dropped precipitously early in the pandemic, are now back close to what we would have expected. They're a little bit below trend. Enrollment in grades 1 through 4, if anything, is now above pre-pandemic trends. Basically, the entire loss that we see at this point is concentrated in middle grades 5 through 8, where enrollment is now down about 8% relative to what we would have predicted, which means we've lost about 20,000 public middle schoolers in Massachusetts, which basically numerically accounts for the entire loss in the state. And you can see that high school enrollments have basically not been at all affected by the pandemic. So just to wrap up and sort of think about what this means and why this might be the case, the broad takeaway here is that 5 years post-pandemic, Massachusetts public schools have experienced sustained enrollment declines. If this webinar were a few weeks from now, we could have even given you the 6-year numbers, because I think they're going to be released any day now, but we knew how urgent this was to do this webinar now. We think that about 2% of local public school students have left those schools, largely for private and homeschool options, which have grown tremendously. Those shifts are heavily concentrated among high-income school districts and among white and Asian families, and also among middle grade students. I'll also pause to say, though, we do this, the bulk of our study in Massachusetts, because the data is so timely. When we take national data, which is lagged by a year, so we can only look to the fall of 2023 across all schools in the country, many of the patterns we've just described to you still show up in the 4th year post-pandemic nationwide, particularly that public school enrollments have declined. Those declines are concentrated among white and Asian families, and that they're concentrated in middle grades. And so I think the thing we want to leave you with is this idea that the pandemic seems to have catalyzed changes in how families evaluate schooling options, and these are not purely temporary disruptions. There's been at least a semi-permanent change in those behaviors, and that exodus of high-income families from public schools may change the political dynamics of support for public education in ways that we should be paying attention to. And I'm happy to stop there, and glad that we'll move on to the question and answer session.
Thanks, Joss. It's really fascinating. And I think particularly that we're not seeing it with new kids coming into the system. So in some ways, it'll be really interesting to know if it's this cohort of kids that experienced the pandemic when they were in elementary school, and whether they're the ones who just kind of permanently got removed, but the rest of the system is moving along regularly, versus whether people have just gotten unhappy with middle schools and are pulling kids out there. So that's really interesting. So you've both gotten to kind of, we get to go into questions now. I get to ask a first question, but then we've got a bunch of questions that came in earlier, and also some, keep throwing them into the chat, because I really would much rather lead this with all of your questions than with mine. I just wanted to start with one, which is really about how we should think about the data that you're presenting relative to kind of the underlying constructs that we want to get at. And I think both Jim and Josh, you both got at this a little bit in your presentation, but when you're thinking about disengagement from school in the paper we just heard, that's just for Massachusetts. What do we think of Massachusetts as being representative? You said that overall those trends were there, but some of those really interesting ones, I don't know how much they'll be in those two situations. And Jim, your study focuses on achievement. Part of and achievement test scores, part of the trends we've seen over time is kind of less interest in test scores. And I wonder if kind of we should feel like the external validity is there, so that kids are really not developing the capacities that they need to thrive, or it's just kind of these tests that we've kind of lost some faith in. So I'd love you both to talk about the external validity of your work and how we should be thinking about that.
I'm happy to start with a very brief comment, which is, we try as best we can in our paper to show that Massachusetts patterns look like the average US patterns we see, at least a little bit lagged in time. I will say one way in which Massachusetts is different from a number of states in the US, which I think might suggest that going forward, these patterns might be stronger in other states, is that Massachusetts has no kind of private school voucher statewide policy of any sort. And in states that have invested in that or are developing those or passing those laws, you could imagine that makes it easier for parents to make the transition from public schools to alternative options, which Massachusetts does not particularly facilitate from a policy perspective.
That's great.
Yeah, Susanna, let me pick up on the generalizability from the NAEP achievement results. Now, I completely agree with your question in the sense that we care a lot about other skills that students need to have to be successful in life. I think we also ought to continue to care about achievement outcomes as well, and especially at the lower end of the distribution. Another way of framing what's been happening here is there's been a dramatic increase in the proportion of kids who score below basic on the NAEP. And being below basic on the NAEP means you don't have basic skills that are demanded at that grade level. And so I totally understand that we want to be thinking about other aspects of kids' development, and I think we ought to be trying to find the comparable data that would allow us to explore that. But I think we should still care deeply about achievement outcomes, especially like the ones we're seeing here, because I do think there's increasing evidence that achievement outcomes signal later life outcomes that we all care about.
I find that answer really compelling. So thank you. I'd like to turn it over now to Ann Dietrich, who put a question in.
Hi, I'm Anne. I'm from City Fund. I was hoping to ask how you have noticed enrollment declines to be connected or linked with either overall city population trends and also with academic performance in schools, whether you see sort of the academic performance as a driver of students entering or leaving schools.
That's a great question. So we didn't explicitly explore those questions. We mostly sort of took the pre-existing population trends as a thing to control for, to think about the counterfactual, but it's absolutely something that we could take a look at. With respect to the academic achievement, though we don't do it in the paper, I will tell you anecdotally from part of what drove me in this research agenda was watching, so all three of my kids go to local public schools in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We had a ton of friends during the pandemic who high-income educated families who left the public schools out of deep frustrations with their pandemic era experiences with them. And part of those frustrations that those parents had and that we continue to have with our schools is the challenge of a lack of academic rigor brought on by, I think, some poor policy decisions, but also the challenges of schools having to deal with exactly the challenges that Jim has pointed out are going on with students. When you have students, large numbers of students who are struggling, the schools have to address those, but that actually leaves another set of students who are not struggling out of the picture in some ways. And I think some of what we're seeing is the families who are leaving or who have left and not returned are the families who felt that their school systems were just not addressing their particular kids' needs for those reasons. And I've certainly seen at least anecdotal evidence of that. It would be great to do a more formal study.
Okay, now I'm going to give a question that Adrian Capone put in to us, and that is for Jim. Can part of the achievement problem be attributed to Common Core state standards and initially, I think, to teaching to the test?
Yeah, it was an aspect of the Common Core that I quite frankly hadn't thought about. But I think that, if I think about so basically the premise of the question is that if the Common Core standards and therefore the tests that are aligned with the Common Core standards don't overlap substantially with the NAEP, that we might see decreases in NAEP scores as the Common Core got implemented. And I think the theory or the hypothesis makes some sense. My recollection is, and again, others on the call may know more about this, but I'm thinking back to an AIR report in 2015, I think that they found there was a lot of overlap between the NAEP and the Common Core standards. There were some meaningful differences. So I think that this may count for part of what's going on, but you would still need to then think about the continuing roughly equal decline that's occurred not just in 2013, 2014, 2015 as Common Core had been implemented, but continuing much later than that. And it also, if you think about the states that are performing worst over that 2013 to 2019 period, some of them are the 4 states that never implemented Common Core. And so again, I think it's possible, but right now I don't think the data aligns with that theory.
Thanks, Jim. We have a question from Anise Dogan. Anise, are you on?
Yes, I am. I'm trying to turn on my camera at the same time. Thank you very much. It's first of all, thank you for the great presentations, both of them. It's very heartening to see NAEP data being put to use this way. Whenever in any platform, whenever I hear arguments against standardized testing, I tell people, well, a world with standardized testing is tough, but imagine one without it. So imagine that we didn't have a world where we didn't have the NAEP data that we have. So that's a comment, but my question is around the enrollment trends. Clearly, they are correlated with variables that are themselves correlated with achievement. So what are the implications of this? And we at NCES struggle with this in terms of the future of NAEP reporting and how to communicate NAEP results. What are the implications for trend interpretations for state assessments? Because if the scores change in a given state from one year to the next, now we're in a situation where we will not necessarily know to what degree that is due to true changes in student achievement versus changes in enrollment patterns. Are states struggling with this question to the degree that we here at NCES, NAEP family is struggling with? How are they thinking about this problem? Thank you.
I'm going to turn this one over to my co-author, Abby.
Yes, hello. That's a very important question, Anise. Thank you so much for coming on to ask it. While we don't currently have the student level data with our analysis across a state or national data, and I'm going to take this moment to say if anyone does have the data that would have the student level test scores, would love to collaborate on this topic to further look into the trends. But the student population turnover that Josh was just speaking to in our findings likely does have major implications on how we would interpret those aggregate test scores, and especially how we interpret the learning loss that we see in these pandemic years. And so, for example, if it was, as Josh was speaking to earlier, a lot of those higher performing students who were moving into the private sectors, then their absence could make it appear that the public school test scores declined more than they actually did. So we could be possibly overstating that learning loss, and essentially just looking at a different population year by year and comparing them as if they are the same. And so we're eager to look more into this question that you ask. There's reason to believe that there might be an overstatement, but again, without the data, we can't confirm this. So if anyone would like to collaborate on getting this data access, we'd love to look more into this question.
Thanks, Abigail. While you're here, I noticed in the chat, you mentioned both birth rates and charter schools. I wonder if you could just give us a little overview of what you found in those two areas.
Yes, and I'm happy to pass off and back and forth with Josh as well. But there were some questions about whether the first graph that Josh was presenting was looking at just the local public schools or looking at public schools with the charter school enrollments. And in our full paper that I attached in the chat, we're actually able to break down both of them. So the first chart just looks at those local public schools, and we actually isolate the charter school enrollment at a later time. But because Massachusetts had a charter school capacity limit, it does affect how we analyze those charter school trends. So if you want to read more about it, happy to reference that paper, talk more later. And we do also account for how much of the total loss we see is from birth rates. We quickly address it. It does not account for all of the loss that we're seeing. So there is still a lot of the loss being driven just by choosing a different sector, but birth rates are included in, again, another additional figure that is in the paper that we're happy to talk about more after this discussion.
Josh, do you have anything you want to add to that, or?
I'll just say, to sort of spoil the charter school result of the paper, what charter school enrollment had been rising very rapidly in Massachusetts up until the pandemic, and then it has absolutely plateaued since then. So that looks like big charter school losses relative to the counterfactual. It is hard to know whether that's the pandemic or the fact that Massachusetts has been bumping up against these legal caps on the number and of charter schools and charter school students that districts are allowed to have. So that's why we sort of should put that to the side a little bit for challenges of interpretation.
So I'm going to give a question that Alicia McFarland sent in, which is how TK or universal pre-K expansion shifted the educational landscape during this time, and both the pros and cons of that. And I think that's for both of you.
I'm happy to start talking, and anyone's welcome to hop on. So for transitional kindergarten, especially with initiatives seen in California and several other states, while it's not universal in Massachusetts right now, we have seen many studies looking at universal pre-K in Boston. There's been several studies posted here at Annenberg, I believe too, by Annenberg authors on this topic, looking that these initiatives often do increase enrollment in the public school district. And I myself also worked with a co-author, a fellow PhD student here at Boston University, Mingyan Ma. We currently have a paper under review looking at the transition into full-day kindergarten. So when districts expanded into full-day kindergarten options instead of just offering half-day kindergarten options, we also saw that enrollment increased in the public school districts in the following years through the middle of elementary school years. And some pros to this, obviously, as we're talking about declining enrollment, it seems that early childhood interventions could possibly help just stabilize some of these early enrollments that we're seeing. However, some cons are that a lot of these enrollments, we do not see the patterns, at least statistically significantly impacting through a lot of the grades, like the middle school losses that we talk about in our paper here. We don't necessarily see their effects in those grades where we're losing the most students. So it might just be more intentional interventions, but it is positive that we're seeing effects through many grades later when we infect early childhood options.
Jim, did you have anything that you wanted to add on this?
No, I don't think, I mean, anything I have would be relatively uninformed speculation regarding the NAEP data. So no.
Relatively uninformed speculation is the title of the next paper I'm writing, so that's great.
I think it should be the title of all my papers. So this exodus from schools and the maybe lack of focus on achievement and all of those things suggests some kind of waning public support for schools. And one of the questions on here, I had a question about that that's a little different that I'll get to, but one of the questions on here is whether we've seen that reflected in other things like voting for school bonds and just interest in schools. So do you know can you inform us on any of those kinds of issues?
I'm going to say no, although I think this is just because there may be work on it that I don't know. I think this would be a topic ripe for study. So I've been fascinated by these changes in enrollment in part because I felt that they were both important in their own right, but also proxies for a general sense that the public schools are or are not serving families well. But I would love some more direct evidence about the extent to which there have or have not been changes in the public's willingness to support public school systems.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add to that other than sort of pointing out, you know, the paper that Matt Kraft and Mimi Lyon wrote regarding the diminishing interest in teaching. And so, you know, I think there are some correlated trends here that might support the hypothesis.
One kind of hopeful thing in the results, though, is actually that the kindergarteners and first graders seem to be coming back to the schools, right? So we've seen this kind of stickiness of being out of school, but actually what I take away from the presentation today is that we have a reason to think that this might not be kind of a drop for middle school. It could be a drop for middle schools forever, but it could just be the kind of cohort of students moving through. So one of the questions that we got from Colby Woods, which is a similar, around hope, is what is currently giving you hope overall for the world? And then the way it was asked was hope for the field. And I'm not quite sure what the field is, but let's go for your views on hope for the world and hope for the field.
So let me jump in. I'm not exactly sure what the field is either, but I think as I thought about, some of the research, I am hopeful, and there's some examples of this where state leaders and district leaders are embracing some of the challenges, and they're moving. Mississippi, again, is, I think, a good example of this, but I think there are other states that are doing similar work. And so I think that I've encouraged some of our PhD students to be thinking about how they can connect with, people in states who are aspiring to make a difference and are willing to take on hard issues. And the other part, a second piece that gives me hope is just, part of it is the people on this webinar. I mean, when I go to conferences and researchers, there are a bunch of young researchers that are engaged in interesting questions, trying to tackle important issues. And for me, again, that's hope. And finally, I think the thing I'll say is I get to walk into a undergraduate education policy class twice a week, and I show them a graph like the one I showed you, and their jaws drop. They say, "Wait, what? What's going on here?" And they're trying to figure out, well, why did this happen, and what can we do about it? And so I think there are a bunch of young people who are willing to engage on these issues, and for me, that's it. Twice a week, I get to have a smile on my face and say, "This is great."
I'm happy to piggyback off of that as well. I think just having interest in this topic, there's a reason that this webinar was picked out of the choices. I think both of these papers, Jim's paper and our paper, both are really relevant to what we're seeing right now and seem like very big questions. And both of our papers aim to just try to focus a little bit more, bite off a little chunk of it. We don't have all the answers per se, but I think that isolating where it is happening, for example, in our paper, looking at just like, for example, the middle school years, we can start to bring interventions to that that subgroup in particular. So encouraging that people across the practice partnership relationship, the parents, the communities, the students are able to talk with district leaders and administrators and see maybe where what they want, and making sure that they communicate with each other on why they might be choosing other alternatives. I think this is just a very good initiation for where we are seeing these losses, and to start this conversation going with lots of other people who are interested in this conversation.
I'll jump in with two quick anecdotes that give me a bit of hope. I have an older son in high school and then twins in middle school now, so both have passed through our middle school. And a few years ago, when our son was in middle school, he was really thirsting for some more challenge in his math classes, and we asked the school what they could do, and we were told very explicitly the school would spend no energy on students like him, in part because leadership was telling them not to spend any energy on them. The district leadership was fired, and the school committee was changed in a set of elections that has slowly started pushing the district, so that my twins now, this year for the first time, have access to some curricula that the schools hadn't had for many years, and are really happy about that fact. So that's a sign that districts can change, and they can change in reaction to parents making their voices heard. And so another thing that gives me hope is that this year in our school committee elections, all those parents that I told you, friends of ours who left for the private schools, whose kids are still in those private schools now, emailed me to say, how should I vote in our local school committee elections? Because I want to bring my kid back when it comes, into the system, probably for high school. What do we need to do to make the district strong? And so I don't think people have written off public schools, and I think they are capable of change. And I think there's an increasing recognition that the schools need to pay attention to what families are asking for. And there's a wide set of things that families are asking for, because families have very different sets of needs, and the schools need to be tackling all of those.
Thank you. I think this is a terrific way to wrap it up. Does anyone online have any hope for the future, or things they want to share about what we heard today? Well, if you get a chance to read the chat, it's really some interesting comments and ideas in there. I think there's a lot more we can do in both of these areas. I'd really like to encourage you to take our feedback survey. It'll just take 1 minute, and it's right there on the screen. And also to subscribe to Ed Working Papers and the Exchange if you're interested in getting reminders of the new papers that are out there. So thank you so much, Jim, Josh, Abigail, for being here today and for sharing your really terrific work.
Yeah, thanks for
so
the
much for having
opportunity.
us.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's been great.
Nate, I guess I'm turning it to you.
Oh, I think this is it. We're done. We so much appreciate everyone's attendance. Please do take our survey. As I said, we're trying to figure out how much of this to do versus just sort of publishing things online. We hear a lot of interest. Having you tell us that you are interested, that you care, will help us make the case both internally, but also to funders, all of which is important. So thank you for coming, and keep the questions coming too. We're trying to figure out how to follow up and sort of keep this conversation going past this 1 hour mark. So take care, everyone, and thanks again.